Well, my name's Robert Frost. I'm from the University of Aberdeen. This is not my period, but I am interested in it and have just attended in this room a very interesting panel on veterans at the end of World War I coming home, which was great preparation for this. Those of us who have read Ola's book will, I hope you'll agree with me that it is an incredible piece of work. It's not at all what I expected when I started reading it and agreed to be on this panel, but I read it with close attention and have some things to say about it, but I thought that we ought to begin by handing the stage to Ola to tell us how she came to write the book and what she was aiming to achieve, and anything you want to say about the book, Ola. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would better stay because I am too short. And I'm, as usual, I'm a rather quiet speaking person, so I would like to stay. To stand. First of all, I would like to say a few words about why this city, why Lviv. And then I'm going to explain why me. So, why Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg? Because it is a city with it is a kind of mythological city. It is a city strongly connected with national narratives, and in every national narrative, Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish narrative, it has a very, very important place. But probably the most important place it has in Polish narrative. There are plenty of books devoted to Lviv. So why to write more about Lviv? Probably other Eastern European cities or Central European cities have no such literature as Lviv has. And at one point I understood that something is missing, and Jarosław Grycak, when I approached him and asked to join common project of open air exhibition, it was 2008, so more than 10 years ago, was very enthusiastic about such initiative, and. Almost 2 years later, we presented this open air exhibition on the Lviv Market Square, just near City Hall entrance. And this exhibition was extremely nice. Was extremely nice perceived. It was really good reception. Hundreds of people wrote down their reactions. And why it was, why it happened? Because first of all, our team decided to not to fight for Lviv, but to have a other perspective from the usual life, usual people perspective, the war seen through their eyes. And then after that, the exhibition ended, everything which is really nice should end at one point, and I felt that something is missing, and I was full of stories, of emotions, and it wasn't enough for me. And then I decided to write a book. And when I was thinking about my approach toward this issue, I decided to change the perspective, and not from the bird's eye, but from the bottom, from the worm's eye view. You know, it's kind of microhistory, but much more than microhistory. I didn't want to write a biography of any of protagonists. I didn't want to write a history of microhistory of Lviv and this particular period of World War II, because most of topics are really well known. We have some data, we have some figures, we have stories. So I didn't want to repeat such stories. I wanted to look how to combine different perspectives, different national perspectives. And I wanted to overcome this national matrix, which is called also grand narratives or master narratives. And I didn't want to present a black and white picture. Instead of this, I presented how many tints of gray color is present in this stories. So the main protagonists of my book are clashed with other smaller protagonists, but smaller doesn't mean that they were less important, but they have other role in this chapter, particularly this chapter or other chapter. And choosing such heroes, I really wanted to present non-heroic narratives. So with not this very sharp division between what is right, what is wrong, and with of course my protagonists are very sure about they are right, but I am trying to show mirrors, different mirrors from other protagonists, from other sources, from other memoirs. And maybe one more thing I should say, that I decided not to interview alive people. I decided to look for testimonies from this time, from the time of World War II and just after the war. So I have noticed that after 20 years or 50 years, when memoirs are wrote down, they are fitting national matrix. They are not personal documents. They are, of course, formally they are ego documents, but they have no features of ego documents. They are just fitting to this national matrix, and that's why I preferred to study very different documents. Sometimes they were a little bit
terrifying.
Terrifying me, because when you're reading such documents as interrogation, and you are looking at signature, the first is quite okay, the next is not quite okay, and the fifth is like completely other person who is impossible to write anything. Of course, everyone has some imagination, and I could imagine, and I do know how terrifying were these interrogations, and I didn't describe all the details in the book, how these interrogations were, but of course I realized that such testimonies are unreliable. And then I had to again compare or to clash with other testimonies. So this few words about methodology, about my approach, and maybe I have to say something about my heroes, my protagonists. They are representative of different milieus. So it was my aim to give as wide perspective as I can. Of course, many parts of intellectual milieu is missing in this book, but at the same time, I wanted to present first of all old professors, old Lviv professors who are creators of the myth of Lviv. And this medical milieu also was very important, and especially one event which shaped our image, a Polish image about Lviv during World War II. I mean, the massacre of Lviv professors in early July 1941. And then artists, musicians, and also writers. So one of protagonists is a representative of Soviet administration, and it was probably the most challenging task for me. Because when I work with this material, with these documents, I still tried to wear others' shoes, but not only wear others' shoes, but walk, and not just walk around the room, but 1 mile, 2 miles, and then I did understand what is going on, it seems to me, but of course it is not whole truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. Well, we now have copies of the book in the room with a striking image on the front cover of musicians playing. And I think one of the striking things about the book is that Ola talked of non-heroic narratives. There are perhaps far too many heroic narratives about the history of this part of the world, and this book does put some of those narratives from below into the story, and the image on the cover is one of harmony and of playing together, which I find striking. But I thought we would hand over to Marci from Yale, first of all, to hear her take on the book.
Hey, thank you. I'm so happy to see so many of you here. I was very happy to be asked to be on this panel. I love this book. And I'm very, very happy this book came out in English translation, you know, which was never assured because it's a complicated, demanding book with details, you know, and it's all about the details. And it's precisely not about, it's precisely written against getting rid of the details in favor of generalizations. And given that, you know, Americans have very short attention spans for reading, I'm especially pleased that despite that, we have an English version of this book. And it's a fantastic cover. Let me start, inspired by the cover, by saying something about one of the musicians that Ola wrote about in this book. So the book is populated with fantastically complex and interesting characters, which is, as a historian, this is what I love, the complicated characters. One of her characters is a cabaret singer named Eugenie Ejbodo. And he's famous for, among other things, singing this song, Tylko w Lwowie, you know, only in Lvov. And, you know, the song is a kind of celebration of the city, which is, of course, a beautiful city and a seductive city and a city that many different people have wanted to be theirs for a long time. You know, and in the song, you know, which he didn't write, somebody named Schlechter wrote the words and Henrik Bard wrote the music, and they're all characters in the book. But they ask questions like, "Bo gdzie jeszcze ludziom tak dobrze jak tu, tylko w Lwowie?" You know, where could you possibly like live so well, only in Lvov? I gdybyś się kiedyś urodzić miał znów, to tylko w Lwowie, you know, and if you were, you know, if I were to be born again, then only in Lvov. And that is very much part of the book, that celebration of a city towards which so much love and passion has been directed. And at the same time, of course, you know, Lvov, Lviv, whatever we decide to call it at a given moment during the Second World War, was a laboratory of horror. I mean, it was a laboratory of human behavior and the human condition in times of extremity. So right away you have, in some sense, the structure of the motif is that this place that is kind of aesthetically dazzling, you know, that is known not only for its architecture, but also for its literature and for its poetry and for its music, you know, and for its skyline, and also as this site, you know, of a kind of theater of horrors. When I reviewed it when the book came out, and I spent a couple months negotiating with my editor at the TLS for more words, you know, and I kept saying, but before I can even get to the book, you know, I need to explain to the non-Slavicist reader what is happening in this city during the Second World War, which is not only so horrific, but so bewilderingly complicated that for people who aren't familiar with it, you need to kind of lay out like one layer of horror and then the next layer and then the next layer. And it's a lot for anyone to kind of get their mind around. And without kind of taking in all those overlapping layers, it doesn't make any sense. One of the reasons I totally understand and empathize with Ola's fascination with the city, even though I don't have the personal connection there that she does, is that I've long been interested in this idea that we don't exactly have a word for in English. In German they say Grenzerfahrung, this kind of border experience, about which a lot of philosophy has been written. Jan Patočka writes about this, Karl Jaspers writes about that, this border situation. You know, when the human condition at moments of extremity, these experiences that lie at the very border of the human condition. This, by the way, was the subject of a very interesting exchange between Edmund Husserl and the philosopher from Kiev, Lev Shestov, during the First World War. In 1916, Shestov, who is a Russian-speaking Jewish philosopher from Kiev, who had then never met Husserl, publishes this passionate polemic with his philosophy called Memento Mori, remember your own mortality, in which he takes issue with this kind of rationalist philosophy and says, well, the thing about reason is that, Husserl wants to believe in reason. He wants to believe reason can do so much. It can do everything. And Shestov says, but the thing is, reason only helps us when we are in like the normal range of human circumstances and human behavior. It doesn't reach into what he calls the polar regions. There are limit experiences to which reason cannot reach and which reason cannot grasp. And philosophy should precisely be about trying to get our minds around those border experiences. And at that point, reason fails us. And Husserl thinks because reason can do a lot, it can do everything. But between a lot and everything, there is a whole world. There's an abyss. And this is a book about those border regions. It's about those limit experiences. And the move that Ola makes initially, which I'm enormously sympathetic to, and I suppose in a kind of egotistical way, because it's something I like to do as well, is to kind of move from the level of talking about nation or ethnicity or even class to the level of the individual in the particular. There's a famous diary entry by the Polish philosopher Stanisław Dżużulski, who manages to die of tuberculosis, I think, at the age of 33 before he gets his hands dirty, and so we can love him. But shortly before he dies in 1911, he writes in his diary, "So nie jest biografia, nie jest w ogóle. What is not biography is nothing at all." And that's been an important inspiration for my work, and I think you could think about that as a kind of departure for Ola's work too, because she's looking at the specificity of the particular details of these very different lives. And the book caused me to think, among other things, about why is it so hard for us to get away from national paradigms? Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, Lvov have been talked about, as, is it a Ukrainian city, a Jewish city, a Soviet city, a Polish city? And it's one of the things I think we all try to do as humanists or as scholars is try to somehow, through an exhaustive attention to the particular, extract something universal. If you believe in the humanities as such, you're kind of, believing that there's something we have to say. There's something we can understand about the world that goes beyond the specificity of our topic. And reading Ola's book made me wonder if maybe the reason why there's been so much clinging among historians to national and ethnic categories is that jump from the individual, particular, empirical to the universal, it's just too big a jump. Like somehow we feel like a need for a mediating third term in a kind of Hegelian sense, like as a crutch. And what Ola does in this book is she doesn't use the mediating third term. Or she doesn't use it as a crutch. She's probing universal questions through attention to the particularities of biography. And of course, what she finds, is that, in real life, people's behavior, their desires, the people to whom they feel close, the people to whom they feel distant, the moments which they're willing to risk their lives, the moments when they sell out, those cannot be reduced to ethnic national categories. There's no way to actually understand, that limit experience, if we reduce it to those categories. And it turns out that, as we might have, guessed if we would have thought harder, that identity is complicated. One of the things I spent a lot of time in this book thinking about are microbiologists. Now, I know nothing about microbiology. I had never really mentally hung around with microbiologists before I read Ola's book. But, microbiologists play an important role in this book. And it turns out that, to be a microbiologist, in Lviv at this time, is to belong to a certain milieu. It's a new field, it's a cutting edge field. It turns out that, people, regardless of their nation or class, feel in particular a closeness to the people who work in their laboratory. That was a different kind of community. And it's a community that we generally don't think about as historians because it doesn't fit in, but it turns out that microbiologists who are working on a similar project, like sometimes that's the person that you feel closest to. And so she probes these stories from this point of view of specificity. And I don't want to talk too long because I want to be able to open this up for discussion, but maybe I'll just say one or two things. And she looks at, that role of who do you feel a solidarity with? Who do you feel an identity with? She looks at the role of friendship. And that turns out to cut across all sorts of stereotypical divides, because the people we love, and the people we hate and the people we care about, that those are complicated relationships that can't easily be reduced to those kinds of categories. And we're now testing them in these conditions of extremity, in these limit experiences. Okay, maybe I'll just say one more thing. One of the stories that I love the most in this book, because the ironies and complexities of the story, I think, kind of capture metonymically so much of what was happening at this time, is there's a character, Michalo Rudnicki, who has a Greek Catholic father, and a Jewish mother, and grows up with Polish spoken in the home, and becomes a teacher of French language. He's living abroad in France and England. He returns to Lviv before the war. He's teaching French and English at the Ukrainian Secret University. He's writing both for Ukrainian language press, and for a Polish language Zionist press. And during the war, in 1942, without a dictionary, he translates Hamlet into Ukrainian. So you have this Ukrainian translation of Shakespeare, by a Jew who is a teacher of French, whose mother tongue was Polish. And Hamlet was then performed in Ukrainian translation on, Adolf Hitler Ring in the center of Lviv in 1943. And he could not be at the performance of the play that he himself translated because it was too risky. As a Jew, he could have been denounced. But that story of Hamlet, and all of the references that go with the time being out of joint and all the layers of irony that it was Rudnicki who did that translation, and the idea of him laboring over that translation of Hamlet without a dictionary, in occupied Lviv into Ukrainian. I felt like that was precisely, that symbolic moment that kind of allowed us to kind of aesthetically grasp the various layers of paradox and of irony. Turn this over to Serhii.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's I think I'm to speak next. Yes. Serhii has said he wants to be the tail gunner, bringing up the end, bringing up the rear. I approached this book as somebody who has no Eastern European roots, who studies a very different period of East European history, down to the partitions, and who has been pulled kicking and screaming into the early 19th century by Frank Sisson to write about Hrushevsky in Galicia and his experience of writing his national history. And it's an extraordinary sensation. It's a very emotional book in many ways, and that is very fitting because this was a period of the history of Lviv in which emotions were very raw. It was a very extraordinary period, and in some ways it's depressing to see what depths humanity can come to, but in others it's a very uplifting book because of the ways in which people coped with extraordinary circumstances that I think none of us would know how we would react in those circumstances. And here was a highly complex society, and something that Marci said reminded me. You said something about generalizations. I remember my father, in an interview, he was a scoutmaster, and he gave a little interview in Edinburgh for a scouting newspaper, and he said the one thing he hates is generalization. And I read this when I was 16 and didn't really understand what he was on about. Then I became a professional historian and had to generalize all the time. And we do generalize, and we generalize in those neat little national or religious or social categories. And I think one thing that Courage and Fear taught me again is that you cannot explain what happens by putting people in little boxes and saying, this is what the Jews did, or this is what the Ukrainians did. And yet so much of our political dialogue is based on such ludicrous overgeneralization. People are people and individuals are individuals. The book is one of, I think, very striking phrases, and I wrote a few of them down this morning when I was thinking about it. It starts in the preface with this phrase about a city that was ripe with conflict yet not steeped in hatred. And that made me think about how human interaction is all about conflict. And we don't really like it. But conflict is part of life. It's part of family life, it's part of city life, it's part of the life of historians. We spend most of our time quarrelling with each other. Yet not steeped in hatred. And it's when hatred comes in. And in Lviv, I think Ola shows very clearly that hatred in many ways came in from without, from outside. There were conflicts, there were difficulties, there were problems from an elite in the city that had in us, and here I have problems with a generalization about what being Polish means. Because for me, studying the 16th and 17th centuries, Polish has a highly complex set of meanings. There were various kinds of Polishness. Just as I think the book shows that in Lviv, in this period, there were various kinds of being Ukrainian. I was very struck by the image of when the Soviets came in and the Kiev and Lviv Ukrainians came together, and the Soviets suddenly thought, oh, what have we done? We've put them together. This is dangerous. And yet, and that was something that I learned from looking at Khrushchevsky about how a Ukrainian historian brought up in Kiev, what a shock it was for him to come to the Piedmont of Ukraine, which is a phrase that recurs in the book. It's a book, to talk of another phrase that struck me, it's nested storytelling. And one of the features of the book is that characters who appear in one chapter suddenly reappear in a different guise in another chapter. And the stories, there is no narrative line. You switch back and forth. Suddenly you're talking about what the Nazis did in the hospitals. And then you're back to the Soviets. And that constant switching back and forth between the Soviet period and the Nazi period really forces you to think about how different and how similar their approaches were in some and other ways, generalization again, towards the poor population of this suffering city. She talks about open versus closed identities. And looking from my perspective as an early modernist, I look into the 19th century, which in my feeling was rather a disastrous century for this part of Europe that we talk about, that there were many people who were trying to make identities closed. And that became more and more prominent, that feeling, towards the end of the century, as narrow nationalisms were constructed, and heroic narratives were constructed, and nationalisms were constructed, identities were constructed that excluded and did not include and refused to allow people the chance to have various identities. So there's another phrase, a Pole by choice. And in many ways what happens at the end of the 19th century and during the First World War and in the period after the First World War is people have to choose in a process that divides villages, it divides families, It divides and causes internal conflict for individuals. There's a lovely phrase on page 155. Poles considered Yuri Poliański a very decent nationalist. And I started thinking, what is a decent nationalist? Is he a polite nationalist? Is he a nationalist who seems on the surface very friendly, but isn't? I mean, but he was a decent nationalist. And I'm now going to go away and think, sort of divide people in generalizations into decent and indecent nationalists. And I think
semi-decent.
And semi-decent nationalists. But nationalism is by itself, it is by its very nature exclusionary. You are with us or you are against us. And yet, when the pressure came on in Lviv during the Second World War, during that terrible period of which Marci spoke, when the pressure came on, people often transcended those barriers that had been erected. I was also fascinated by what I saw as traces of an older way of doing politics, the way of doing politics that I recognize. Ola talks at one point about how Poles did not see participation in the Soviet City Council as collaboration. And I thought, well, this is them practicing their principle of self-government, which goes back centuries. That is how you subvert a powerful centre, is that you govern yourself at the local level, and if we can perhaps govern the city council and take it over, perhaps we can mitigate the terrors of the Soviet system, which just shows that they didn't understand what the Soviets could and were capable of doing. And I finished the book by thinking how stupid the Soviets were. That actually they had the opportunity to create a society in this part of Ukraine that could have supported what they were doing. And yet what do? They abolish the Shevchenko Society. Gosh, that's going to make them popular. They try to take it over and then they abolish it. And what struck me is the way in which, when you talk to students or you talk to anybody about the Soviet system taking over in Eastern Europe, it's also black and white. Suddenly the Soviets are there and then everything, they just have power over everything. And yet the way in which they take over is most interesting, and I think Ola charts that very well in the book about how at first, they promise things and they keep institutions as they are or say they're going to, and insidiously they take them over. There's a wonderful book in Polish, whose author's name I forget because I'm getting elderly, about the way in which the Polish Communist Party tried to take over the Polskie Towarzystwo Historyków. And it took them a long time, and they never really managed it completely. But it was not an easy process. But of course the Poles, well, as I say, what is a Pole? But one of the problems about this part of Europe is that national divisions coincided a lot of the time with class divisions. And sometimes what we take to be national divisions were in fact to do with class, and Polish contempt for Ukrainian is in fact the sort of contempt for the lower classes you could see in 19th century England. But there it was not overlaid with divisions of nationhood. I loved the quip of Boy Zelensky about his work at Lviv University. At a Ukrainian university, I give lectures on French literature to Jews in Polish. And I thought, yeah, this is in very many ways, this is a magical part of the world, but that society is now gone, thanks to what happened in the Second World War. And in many ways, this book is a eulogy to that society. And it is a marvelous eulogy. And one of the things that struck me too was the photographs, some of the archival materials, documents that percolate the book which are wonderful and deserve reading. Mikhailo Rudnitsky's personnel form. A personnel form, a Soviet personnel form, is actually a very interesting document, especially when you read about Rudnitsky's experience and his life, and the little compromises that people have to make just to survive. And I come from a society which pontificates about Poles and Ukrainians and Jews and so on in Eastern Europe without having any idea of what choices these people were forced to make. It's very easy to condemn all sorts of things in Eastern Europe. And I always ask them, what would you have done with a gun at your head in that way? It is a marvellous book, and at that point I shall shut up and let other people talk. But I've got to be chair, so I shall have to exert some order. Serhii, over to you.
Well, thank you. It's, as you noticed, it's the book that just appeared. It was even late for this panel for a few minutes. It's a very new book in that sense. And presentation of new books is always a very trying experience. You talk about a book that people didn't have a chance to read yet. This book is different. It appeared a few years ago in Ukrainian and in Polish, and certainly people here at this panel had an advantage of getting that book ahead of time. And the Ukrainian edition had a wonderful portrait of a young girl. Confusing things, that young girl was your mother, and she is in the story, and that picture is in the story. And this is a book which is very personal on one level, but this is also the way to exit the world, to exit the relationship, cultures, emotions, that probably otherwise we as historians actually are unable to do. And Ola was able to do that really, really masterfully. So it's a major contribution to our understanding of war, of the region, of the city, of interethnic relationship in a very personal way that, again, as I said, at least in my reading experience, very few books can match that. And it also presents the story of the city and the story of the region in a very unusual way. That, as already mentioned, goes beyond our regular column and boxes, and sees that there was this interrelationship, that there was such thing as citizenship in the city and citizenship in the society as a whole. My recent research was on the American airmen in Ukraine, in Poltava, Mirgorod, and Pyryatin in 44-45. And some of them, they visited Lviv, because that's where the Soviets allowed them to go, to salvage American airplanes that were landing there. And they left, then filed reports when they came back about the city. And those were probably one of the first reports about also Holocaust in the city. And they were trying their best to understand what was going on, but it's also a very simplistic picture to a degree, the picture that was maybe then replicated in later historiography. So there were the Poles, and then there were the Soviets, and there were Germans before that, and then there were Jews who were massacred, or who disappear as a result of the Holocaust. They were trying to figure out what was there. Again, those were the first accounts, and in my reading, at least, historiography didn't move much from the accounts of 1944. And what Ola does there is provides that complexity. The blurbs that are there and the discussion that we have reflects, of course, a big story of this very human relationships between representatives of different ethnic and religious groups. But there is also one story that Ola was talking about, and Robert also referred to that, and that's that's the relationship between different kind of Ukrainians. And Lviv, at the time of the study of when the book looks at that city, it's more often than not city under occupation. The characters that make it on the pages of the book are kind of good guys generally. That they are the ones who were born in Lviv, who basically deal with all these issues, deal with these challenges that come from their own communities and societies, and also from other societies. And there is only one representative of so-called occupational administration, which happens to be then quite prominent Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Marchenko. And I thought also that to the list of maybe groups, nationalities, identities that meet in that or interrelate in that city, interrelate may be a better word, during that period of time, there are also two Ukraines that meet there in that sense for the first time. There was short meeting during the revolution, but that was also the time when the Ukrainian Soviet project was not there. And we see how Robert mentioned that the Soviets were maybe not very smart, right? And they create a situation where these two Ukraines meet, and it's interesting how they interact with each other. And at the end, it's the liberal Lviv Ukrainian academia that wins over Marchenko, who was a product of the Soviet, just an ideal Soviet red professor, peasant, collective farm activist, who comes with some sense of Ukrainian identity, but which is basically very closely linked to communist project. And it's interesting how he discovers that world around him. And when I read that part of the chapter, that also resonated with me on a personal level. My father-in-law, when he was a child, his uncle somehow was from central Ukraine, was sent on a business trip to Lviv, and he took that boy who was 11 years old to the city and to Lviv, and he saw certain things for the first time. And he's not around anymore, but till the end of his life, when he was a gardener, and when he liked something that he did, he was saying, "Jak w Stryjskому parku." He was saying that in Russian, by the way, but again, that was the cultural experience that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And to conclude, it's again, Robert was saying that it's a story about the city that is not there. It's its memory about the people that are not there. And I thought that the Marchenko story, again, the title of the chapter is "Barbarian in the Garden." The garden is, of course, well, in that particular case, it's also the city. It's interesting that what happened to that barbarian, in a sense, of people like him, how they were transformed, and how Lviv and the environment of the city and the streets themselves, that it looks like that they have that still spirit that was not Soviet at all. You just go there in Soviet times and you realize that you're in the presence of something else. How it transformed the rest of Ukraine, and that story that certainly continues till today. So I certainly recommend, for those of you who didn't have a chance to read it either in Polish or in Ukrainian, get it in English, and it's a great collaborative achievement. So Ola brought together not only these characters in this book, but also different institutions that normally don't work with each other. And well, we have certainly a support from the Polish government. We have Collegium Europy Wschodniej. We have the Academic Studies Press and our own press at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Again, so that's also an achievement in its own right. So I want to use this opportunity also to thank everyone who contributed to this publication. So thank you.
Ola, would you like to say anything about any of the points we've raised?
Maybe really few words. Barbarian in the Garden. Barbarian in the Garden is the title of a very well-known Polish essayist and poet, Zbigniew Herbert. It was his first book of essays, and his impression from his first travel to the West Europe, and especially to France. He had an opportunity to travel through France and through Italy, and his impressions and thoughts about this travel and about medieval art, ancient art. They have this title, Barbarian in the Garden. That means that this Polish writer, a Polish poet, is traveling through the Europe and is treated as a barbarian. And it is a kind of irony, and of course Marchenko was not a barbarian in the garden, but he was treated as barbarian in the garden by all this old professor school, Lviv professor school. And I know that he understood this because in his interrogation, in his testimony for interrogators, he is describing the situation of his when he's in charge in Lviv University, in Saltykov-Shchedrin metaphor, Gorod Glupov, and he's trying to persuade his interrogators that he wasn't nationalist. He just tried not to be like a protagonist of Saltykov-Shchedrin when he came to Gorod Glupov and destroyed all the schools. So it is very many levels of this title of this chapter. It is just my explanation why I decided to use this title. And some of my first readers persuaded me not to use this title, but I was eager to do this. I believe it was a good choice of the title. What Marci said was about this border situation. I can't repeat.
Doświadczenie graniczne, that kind of grenzerfahrung, a kind of limit situation, I guess you could say in English.
It reminds me other story about Yuri Lavrinenko, who appeared in Lviv in 40s, in 43, 44. And then he wrote an essay for Kultura in 1959, which is kind of reaction toward Czesław Miłosz's Captive Mind. And it is literature of grants. I can't pronounce.
Borders,
yes. So it is really striking me how people react to this situation and how they understood this extreme, challenging. It's not the proper word. Not extreme, not challenging. It is something much more serious than challenging and extreme. And last but not least, when you referred to Eugeniusz Bodo and Tylko we Lwowie, it is part of Polish myth. And Soviet were maybe not so stupid as you believe. They tried to employ this myth, but to employ this myth to their purposes, to their aims, and they translated this song. Pavel Grigoriev, he was a Soviet Russian writer, and Bodo sang this song, and it goes like that. Во Львове ремонт капитальный идет. Шьют девушки новые платья. And it is, of course, part of new propaganda, the Soviet propaganda, but it was so attractive for audience, so attractive for Soviet audience that the whole ensemble of theater, Lviv jazz, traveled through the all European part of Soviet Union and gathered audience, and they were very well recognized not only by the audience but also by Soviet authorities. They were very well paid. And then they jumped to the last wagon of Polish army, Anders' army, and they became Polish heroes. But nobody of these two was Pole. One was Ukrainian origin from the Greek Catholic family, others were Jews, but Eugeniusz Bodo died because he was of Switzerland citizenship, and he was obviously spy. That's why he died. But other Polish citizens, but not Poles, survived, and they joined this Polish master narrative, and they create this narrative in this Great Journey film made in 1946. So this story, heroic and martyrology story about this great journey through the whole of part of Soviet Union, Middle East, Africa, and then Italian campaign. And our trip is not finished. It is not the end of our trip. We will fight again when time will be good for this struggle for independence. So it is kind of heroic narrative, but the creators of these heroic narratives were not Poles, and they changed their identity during this great journey.
Yeah.
Oh, can I? Okay. Listening to all the talk has reminded me some other. Another thing about this book that was important to me in that connection, which is something I've been kind of obsessing about really since 2000 when Jan Gross's book on Yadovny came out. And I felt like that opened up looking at the experiences of German occupation and Soviet occupation in an interactive way. Like, what happens to people? What does it do to the human condition when you are passed back and forth? We can theoretically, compare Stalinist occupation and German occupation, but for the people who were experiencing it, it wasn't something, to be compared theoretically. It was something that was kind of deeply intertwined and overlapping. And one of the aspects of those multiple occupations, that being passed back and forth, that Ola brings out is, and I think she uses the phrase divide and conquer, the ways in which strategically, both of these ostensibly ideologically based regimes, which was true, also tried to play off you know, people against other people. You try to play off the Ukrainians against the Poles, and the Jews off the Ukrainians, and those things can be. And the Habsburgs tried this too. I mean, 1848, you know, the Habsburgs are trying to play off the Croatians against the Hungarians, but they do it. It happens in Lviv in this grotesque way during the Second World War, as people are getting passed back and forth. So even as these two totalitarian regimes are working on social engineering projects, and the Soviet social engineering project was, I mean, it was the most grandiose social engineering project the world has ever experienced. They're working on trying to transform human beings, you know, and at the same time, they're trying to play off everyone against everybody else, and those alliances and those, you know, who's going to be privileged and who's going to be especially persecuted can change overnight. Everyone can be induced or incited or given an incentive to betray everybody else. You know, and that then becomes a laboratory of what happens to any kind of interpersonal relations. The historian Anya Muller did a book, you know, a remarkable book in my opinion lately, about what happens to the self in Soviet prison. She does a close reading of women in a Stalinist prison cell in post-war Poland, you know, and what kind of, in conditions of maximum repression, what happens to the subject? You know, is there still a self there? You know, can the self be crushed? Can the self be reinvented? And I feel like Ola is doing that in these most extreme conditions for intersubjectivity, for interpersonal relations. What happens to, what is the relationship between both identity and the self, and most importantly, interpersonal selves and how they relate to one another in these conditions of extremity that are working specifically at trying to undermine any kind of social cohesion and give people an incentive to betray one another. I mean, it becomes a kind of laboratory of that experiment to see what can be overcome. You know, in what conditions can people transcend? In what conditions can they be crushed? In what conditions can they be induced to betray people? In what conditions can they be implicated? And what happens that's unexpected? I mean, it's a kind of grotesque laboratory, but it happened, you know, and looking at it tells us something that we can't easily get about interpersonal relations without looking at that polar region, at that extreme case, as Shestov would describe it.
Yes, I said they were stupid. That doesn't mean they weren't cunning. Although, in my experience, one thing about communism is it has no sense of irony. In 1982, under martial law in Krakow, I saw an exhibition called Za wolność waszą I naszą, and the man they'd chosen to no sense of irony. Anyway, I think we still have plenty of time, so I think at that point we should open it up to the audience, to people who have read the book and wish to comment on it, to people who haven't read the book and wish to find out more about it. Are there any questions from the floor?
Just
Frank? Oh, sorry.
No,
No,
just
carry
one
on.
question. Is the English edition just a translation of the Ukrainian and Polish?
It is just a translation.
Okay, wonderful.
It wasn't changed.
Okay.
From the Polish or the Ukrainian?
From Polish.
From Polish.
Yes.
Frank?
Could you tell, we talked about two Ukraines, so let's talk about various reactions to the book that you've had, both within Ukraine, that is difference between people who live in Lviv, people who live in Western Ukraine, people who live in the rest of Ukraine, or various reactions in Poland. You know, what, I know it's hard to typify them, but if you could give us a few reactions that would show us what surprised you in reactions, what was unexpected, and could place it for us in those readerships.
Thank you, Frank, for this question, and I will start with other point. Ukrainian publisher was in Kiev, not in Lviv, and he thought, or he believed that this book is mostly for Lvivians, not for other audience, not for other readers, and that that's why the book was presented on the book fair of Lviv 2015, and it was awarded by Grand Prix. And then the reception of the book started, and it was very high point of the start of the book. But it was a very enthusiastic reception in Lviv, and I was really a little bit surprised by reactions of Ukrainian not only intellectuals but different audience in Kiev and in Eastern Ukraine. And once happened that I signed the book many times, and some of the books went to the frontier, to the soldiers, and I saw the reactions of soldiers. So of course I didn't expect it. I couldn't expect. No one of us could expect the Russian-Ukrainian war. When I wrote the book, it was 2012, 2013, but until the end of 2013, I didn't expect the war, and I didn't expect that this book would be perceived on this war. So it was really surprisingly and struck me very much. But not only this, also young generation reaction was striking. Now I know that I have to write down or record memoirs of my grandmother or grandfather who was resettled from Chernobyl, or I have many of such reactions. Now I know that I have to care about my family story, that it matters, that this silence is very loud. I mean, milczenie mówi, milczenie говорит. And this silence of generation of my grandmother and even my mother was a really important part of my experience, and maybe that's why I started to write this book. As far as Polish reception is concerned, it was very different and not so emotional, rather skeptical, but also very not as much enthusiastic, but very supporting. And I was awarded by Pruszyński Award from Polish Pen Club. So it was very important for me award, and my book was in the book conkursy. Book
competition.
Yeah, competition in different in all this competition. It was 1 of 10, 1 of 3, 1 of 5. So, but I think that something changed in Poland. I mean, at the end of the first decade of 2000s, probably this book would have other reception. after 2010, it has a completely different reception. And we return to this pattern of very strong division between what is ours, what isn't ours, and unfortunately, I am very. It is very difficult for me this experience, not because of a reception of the book, of course, but because it is my country.
Yes, the relentless desire for a positive image of your nation is often counterproductive. Any more questions?
So much. I have to read the book in English. I read some of it in Polish, and my Polish lacks a certain amount of subtlety. But just a question. I think this is the goal that we're all reaching for is an integrated history, not a nationalist history, not a ghettoized history. And but because of our training, because of the context we know, because of the languages we know, it's a challenge, it's a difficulty, it's some ways dangerous. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about if you feel that there's something you couldn't quite reach. Are there some voices that aren't heard, some stories that aren't told?
The whole book is about untold stories, and of course it is not whole of untold stories. I choose such protagonists because of sources, because of my conception. I wanted to show different part of intelligentsia milieu, but of course something is missing, and first of all, German testimonies. Not because I'm not unfamiliar with German, it's not a problem, but because it would be really difficult to wear his shoes for me. And it is my limitation. It is very, probably very personal. But also because of sources. I couldn't find such sources. So I found one, but it was not enough. It was album of pictures. And it is part of my family story. But nothing more, nothing written. So it is impossible to use this. But for sure we can present other perspectives, and I believe that particularly one perspective is missing, and it is priests of Greek Catholic Church and of Rome Catholic Church, but I believe that such book will appear very soon. And also I found many testimonies and many documents which were extremely interesting. For example, interrogation of Henryk Hescheles, who was the editor-in-chief of Polish language newspaper, Chwila, Zionist newspaper. Very interesting. Another example was Emil Sommerstein, who was a very famous Jewish representative and parliamentary deputy and lawyer. He was arrested just directly after Soviet troops came, crossed the border. They captured him and transported him to first to Kyiv and then to Lubyanka. That's why interrogations are in Moscow archive, and obviously I can't read this. And after the war, he didn't write his testimonies, and his daughter Maria Tenchin not told, but witnesses that he didn't speak at all about his experience during prison and during Soviet camp imprisonment. So again, I really wanted to write about I really wanted to write about Emil Sommerstein, but I couldn't. And it was a very big surprise for me in Washington just a few days ago when I met his granddaughter. It was amazing.
Yes, but it's in that sense it is very much the book of a historian.
Mm-hmm.
We all have fragmentary sources, and there are many characters we would like to write about, but cannot. There was a question over there, and then Marci wanted to come in. Yes.
So your book focuses on various groups of the Lviv intelligentsia, and you start on a very personal note, as you admitted, and you focus on certain groups because of those personal connections, right? Like, you know, your grandmother saved, like, scientists, physicians. Then the chapter on Lviv mathematicians, you say that, you know, as a teenager, you were like fascinated with mathematics. And of course, there was this portrait of your mother as a little girl, and then there was a chapter of artists. So, you know, we have those chapters that you kind of have personal involvement in that. But there are other chapters that, you know, so my question is, did you know in advance which groups of intelligentsia you wanted to focus on? Or it's just your research, your sources kind of like led you a certain way that you wanted to focus then on, you know, writers and performers, like theater people, entertainment people, historians. And so, like, I wonder if it's, you know, like you had this concept, like, in advance, or it kind of came out as you worked on it, other than those chapters that you had a personal connection with?
Actually, it is my approach, and it is a kind of literary work. I mean, I wanted to shorten the distance between me and readers. That's why I decided to tell my family story. And not because it is so impressive or so interesting. Not at all. It is a story like thousands of stories. So maybe not as thousands, because not so many people were rescued Jews that time. But why I chose this or that protagonist? Because of sources, of course. And then I thought about how to shorten this distance. So it was that way, not the other way.
Although in a city the size of Lviv, of course, among the elites, people are interconnected and they
Of
know
course.
of people, and
Of course.
the connections come through the book. Marci.
Lviv and Lvov is a kind of city where everyone knows about everyone. So and it is very very full of rumors, full of.
There's a phrase in Scots where people say, "I kent his father, I knew his father." It's a withering phrase. It's not meant to be a positive phrase. Marci.
Okay, I actually have a question for Ola, which is inspired in part by what you were saying, sadly, about the current situation in Poland and this division into what is ours and what is not ours, which reminded me that you start this book with the story about your family and how you came to the topic, and the marriage of your parents, a Polish woman and a Ukrainian man, a Polish woman from Lviv, and hearing "najważniejszy, że jest nasz," and wondering what that meant. Most importantly that he's ours. And that your interest in the story, in some sense, came from speculation on what that nasz meant. And one of so this is actually a two-part question. I'm fascinated by this whole phrase "nasz, nashi," and in part because I have a foreigner's kind of estrangement from all of these Slavic languages. So it's one of these words that we have in English, but we don't use it this way in English. It struck me at the beginning of the war in the Donbass, there was a young, fantastically talented young Polish journalist, Paweł Pieniążek, who was covering the war in the Donbass at the beginning, who I got to know, who wrote 2 great books, a reportage about it. And he's talking about, being in these places and people are shooting at one another, and he has very good Ukrainian and very good Russian, but he's not from there. It's not exactly his place, although he's a native Slavic speaker, and people are coming to him and saying, "Nashi, nashi?" And he's trying to figure out, what exactly do they mean? I mean, who do they perceive, and who is ours at that moment, who is on our side, meaning the ones who don't seem to be shooting at us but on our behalf, but it's a kind of hazy distinction at the moment because people are shooting and we happen to be there, so which ones ours might be. But that when I tried to tell that story in a lecture, I realized that we don't have that, it doesn't work in English. That whole concept of what it means to be Savoy, what it means to be nasz. How expansive or how limited that category is. So I wanted to ask Ola, I guess, a 2-part question. One is you can talk more about how that phrase kind of both haunted her and led her into that story about what belongs to us. Where do you draw the boundaries between what belongs to you and what doesn't, which is obviously a kind of existential boundary and not a kind of capitalist private property type of boundary. And also in connection with this, and I feel like I can get away with asking this question because Ola is trained as a philologist, even though this is a book of history, what could and could not be translated into English? Is of course translating from Polish into Ukrainian is very different from translating from Polish into English. I mean, there are all sorts of things that translate very nicely among Slavic languages that translate much less nicely into English.
I'm not ready to answer for your question about translation. Actually, it was my sister who translated this book, and it was not very obvious to accept such solution for me, but she insisted, and she persuaded me that this book should be translated, and she is eager to do this. And of course, I know that it means that there are also limitations. She's not native speaker. However, I think that she did the best, and I don't know. I couldn't judge about translation, but as far as I know from people who already read the book, it is quite a good translation, and how she fought with or struggled with such tricky places. I have no idea, but I know that many fragments of the book I had to explain very sometimes in the very long letters. And what is nasz? And maybe some of you who are of Polish origin remember the very well-known film Sami Swoi. It is a film about forcibly resettled families who were actually enemies, but they were at the same time Sami Swoi, because they came from northeastern part of interwar Poland. They were resettled towards on the west part of after-war Poland, and Sami Swoi. And then jumping to this quotation, najważniejsze, że jest nasz. It's my mom who is writing to her 40 years older friend Jarosława Muzyka, who is Ukrainian, and my mother was Pole. And she's writing najważniejsze, że jest nasz. And I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand at all, because it's not a. My mother didn't exclude, and it's. She had very inclusive personality, so I couldn't understand, and then it suddenly happened that. I understand, because as mother was forcibly resettled, my father also was forcibly resettled. So it is kind of community of people who stracili swą małą ojczyznę.
Who lost their little homeland.
Ours may just mean they came from Lviv.
No, my father didn't come from Lviv. He was from the Polish part of the border and from the little small village, so no.
But he was nasz.
But he was nasz.
Peasant?
Yeah.
Not at all. Couldn't be. In very strict.
So your mother married outside of the circle of nashi, in that sense.
In this nationalistic sense, yes. In her sense, no. He was part of nashi.
It's a slippery one, Thomas.
We
better hand over the flame.
I haven't read the book, but it strikes me that you talk so much about family and the importance of family and your interest in your family. And there is one theory of nationalism that says that nationalism can only arise when family declines. Only when family bonds decline can nationalism rise to its highest levels. And we see this in some parts of the world today, for example in the Middle East, where there's no competition whatsoever. Family always comes first. And nationalist projects constantly fail before the basic fact of family. And an example in Europe, I think, would come from the aristocracy, who trace their roots back many, many generations through many different phases of history. And family is important to them because they have this history and they have this genealogy. And the outstanding example of that I can think of is during the Second World War, when one of the Habsburgs was arrested by the Nazis and had to fill out a form on which there was nationality, and he was told to put German there. And he refused, and then he was told to put Polish there, and he again refused, and he said, I'm not Polish, I'm not German, I'm a Habsburg. So, and perhaps you have some kind of relation to people like that go back towards family and away from nationalist extremism, and this might be reflected in your book. I don't know, I haven't read it yet, but might just be.
I'm not sure about this. I mean, I really started with my family story, but it was not only because my family is Polish-Ukrainian, was Polish-Ukrainian, but first of all because I wanted to overcome such divisions, and it was a good way to overcome. So not because of family stories, but because of way of overcome. So it is good way through the family story, from this bottom level, but of course not because these families were so strong, not at all.
In the extreme circumstances of the period, sometimes people realized they were Nash because of pressure from the outside, and the choices they were forced to make. The occupiers tried to divide and rule, but sometimes the very fact of occupation meant that people developed some sort of solidarity and would help people that they'd never thought before that they had much in common with. And there's a striking line about how some of those who saved Jews were the fiercest anti-Semites before the war. But suddenly, circumstances had changed. We still have about 7 minutes, so are there any other questions from the floor? Serhii, or from beside you.
What is next in the store? So what are you working on, and what the publishers and the readers should get ready for?
There's at least 2 projects that I know of.
Many projects and such a little
time.
Okay. Sounds familiar.
For all of us, but actually I'm working, and this project is on the process. So it is history, more or less about literature, but not only about. It is about a memory, but not only. It is about erasing memory just after the Second World War. Just with it starts with Stalin toasts to generals, to Soviet generals, za wielki ruski naród, and it ends with the beginning of de-Stalinization. So it is a story about erasing memory and about Soviet attempts to create new narrative, and all narratives which are not fitting to this Russian Soviet narrative are removed. And if people are insisting on telling their stories in literature, not only in their life, in literature, they are persecuted. So different ways of dealing with the past. Soviet writer who is very well recognized by Stalin's award in early 50s, who wrote about Jews in Lvov sewers. How how he changes his plot.
This is Belayev?
Belayev,
Belayev.
конечно. And other history is Olga Duchimińska, who published her novel Eti, and Eti is the name, not about Nashi, is Esther probably. It is about a young Jewish woman who escaped from Lviv ghetto and survived in the neighborhood of Lviv in the village. And this novel was had so bad reception. It was so critic Parchomenko, and then after 2 years, 2 years later, she was arrested. She was accused in being involved in
assassination of
Halan, and she was sent to Soviet camp, and she was already 17 that time, and she was sentenced to 25 years of the camp, and she laughed at the court. It is. I could not survive. It's stupid to 25 years. It's stupid, but she survived.
They were stupid.
She survived, and she returned to Galicia, and she wasn't rehabilitated after that, and she died at the age 104.
So they were not so stupid.
No. It is a long story, but to make it short, no one recorded interview, and it is one of the reasons how I have to deal with it, and I have two more stories, but I don't want to.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time, and on. But
Ivan Mihl, your grandson, never.
No.
No. And was she punished in a degree because of her daughter?
No.
So
Because she was a friend of a Greek Catholic Church, whose son was accused in assassination of Halan.
Yeah, no, I know that, but her daughter was active in politics and winds up abroad.
Maybe reveal the name of that person. Have you mentioned the name
Of whom?
of the person that we are?
Duchimińska.
Duchimińska, okay. Yeah, because I missed that.
Well, it was an arbitrary system, and the last of the things that struck me was the wonderful story about the unfortunate photographer Arthur Nacht, who does a big print of Beria for the May Day procession, and because of a slight slip of the grid, Beria ends up with 4 eyes and is put up watching over the parade. And they managed to convince the authorities that this was a genuine mistake, and so he gets off free. So, but Beria with 4 eyes is a wonderful image. And I think at that point,
I really wanted my editor to put a picture on it. Put a picture with this little shift.
Alas, the picture does not survive in the records. But on that note, I think it just remains for me to thank Ola and my other panel members for discussing what a wonderful book it is. And of course, if you haven't read it, you can buy it now. It's on sale in the exhibition hall, is it? Or here, if people want to buy it here, it's on sale here and now. So Thank you. It's a wonderful book, and if you haven't read it, you must.
But buy it first.
But buy it first. Yes. So thank you.